welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be looking at the life and work of Bill Mauldin. Bill Mauldin was a two-time Pulitzer Prize winning cartoonist and journalist, very important historical figure. We talked, Chris, some time ago about Thomas Nast, who was a political cartoonist as well. Of course, he came up with the donkey for the Democrats and the elephant for the Republicans. And today we're going to be looking at Mauldin, and maybe our listeners don't know the name, but they probably know at least one of his drawings.
You know, especially in light of the things that are going on while we're recording this podcast in Ukraine. And, we are hearing firsthand reports. We're seeing 24-hour, 7-day-a-week coverage from right there in the midst of the battlefield. We start to see the importance of political cartoonists, but also individuals that were willing to actually go and serve within the army and to bring back stories from the battlefield. Ray, if you even go back to World War II, we didn't have the intense coverage of film and TV and even radio per se that we have today. And so we long to kind of get a viewpoint from the battlefield. And that's where these political cartoonists came about. Thomas Nast in the Civil War. And here you have Bill Mauldin, who is this professional cartoonist who really gives us not just a scene from the battlefield, but the relationships within the army itself, especially between the generals and the infantry. And his illustrations are poignant and they're very, very deep. And, I know that it took me a long time to fully appreciate art or even a political cartoon. But once it clicked for me, and I think it was Thomas Nast that did it for me, I'm drawn by their work now and how it really tells a lot in picture rather than words. And so Bill Mauldin, who I'll just be honest, I want to thank, this was a listener request. And so I just want to give a shout out to that listener who sent in Bill Mauldin and asking us to review and do a podcast on him. Thank you so much, because you opened up my eyes. I was familiar with one of his works, but I never really understood the person behind it. And because of you and this podcast, I have a whole nother deep level appreciation and respect for this guy. So I just wanted to say that, Ray, before we really get into his life. Thank you, especially in this time that we're living in. It's just a reminder of how important these individuals were to convey what the scene really looks like.
Yeah, and I definitely echo those thoughts. We encourage our listeners to always send us show ideas. We've had a few, and we do encourage, if you've got an idea you'd like to hear us talk about, please send us that. You can contact us on Facebook, Twitter, or by email. So let's talk a little bit about Bill Mauldin, some of his biographical information. He was born in New Mexico in 1921, and he died not too many years ago in 2003. I guess now that's almost 20 years ago, but he was born there in New Mexico in 1921, and he was born into a military family. I found interesting that his father was an artilleryman in World War I. So he is the military in his family. He goes to Phoenix Union High School, where he starts working for the Coyote Journal, which I guess was the newspaper there at the high school, at the Phoenix Union High School. He doesn't graduate there. He actually graduates later on. He doesn't graduate with his class. But after leaving high school, he studied at the Chicago Academy of Fine Arts. So he has an artistic background. He has a journalistic background, even as far back as high school. But in 1943, of course, things are going to change for him. In 1940, he enlisted in the Arizona National Guard. And just a few days later, not weeks, days later, the the 45th Infantry Division, in which he was a part, was federalized. And basically, for our listeners who do not know what that means, normally the National Guard is under control of the individual state. But in certain moments, like a World War, for example, the President of the United States federalizes a National Guard unit, and that takes that Guard unit and puts it under the control of the President of the United States. So he's there in the 45th Infantry Division, and he is sent overseas. He is in 1943, in July of 1943. He's involved in the invasion of Sicily, and later he's involved in the Italian campaign. And Chris, it's here in the 45th Infantry Division, in the front lines of World War II, where he is going to make a name for himself as a political and military cartoonist.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that he wants to do is he wants to help us understand war in a way that no one else can really understand it, because the individuals that were not there, that were not fighting, it gives a sense of really what it's all about. And he later goes on to say, these are his words. He said, quote, "I drew pictures for and about the soldiers because I knew what their life was like and I understood their gripes. I wanted to make something out of the humorous situations which come up even when you don't think life could be any more miserable." And he was very blunt that being an infantryman was extremely difficult. He even said that if you really want to become a pacifist, join the infantry, because it was dirty, it was ugly. And most of his cartoons pictures infantrymen looking as if they've been through the mud, very dirty. And I think that's his style, to kind of show that this is not for anyone, that this is very, very difficult work. It's very hard, and he wanted to show us how the soldiers lived. And I think he just bears that all out in truth in the form of this cartoon, and it gets to a mass group of people. They're able to see it.
Yeah, and actually the War Office supports, as he is putting out, 6 cartoons a week at one point, the War Office, the U.S. War Office, actually supports the publication of his cartoons. One of the reasons they did was because he didn't romanticize anything. It showed the dark side of war. He showed this is, as they say, war is hell. It was not going to be an easy, quick thing that was going to happen. So he is actually supported by the War Office. And it's not just American troops, by the way, that see Mauldin's various cartoons, some of which we'll talk about in a second. European soldiers also see the cartoon, showing the similar experience that soldiers had, regardless of whether they were European or American, the similar experience these soldiers had there on the battlefield.
Yeah, and I go back and I invite our listeners to kind of pause the podcast and go do some Google searches on Bill Mauldin, Mauldin, and you can find many of his political cartoons that are there. We might reference a few of them in the podcast, but it would be helpful for you to kind of to see that visual of what we're talking about in the way that that he could only do. I mean, he showed those infantrymen in situations in which they were not just dirty, but as we said, that they were filthy. And I mean, because he wants people to see that these are the guys who are on the front lines. These are the guys that are fighting the war. But Ray, the other thing that he does is he shows a stark difference between the generals and the soldiers. He makes very strong references through his drawings that the guys who were overseeing the war were completely different from the guys who were fighting the war, and that the officers didn't like the infantrymen, and the infantrymen didn't like the generals, because one is basically taking their life in, right there on the battlefield where they could die at any moment. And then the other, who's the general, is looking from a distance. And I remember seeing one where this soldier is going and he's at a desk with another soldier, and the guy is holding up a Purple Heart medal, and the infantryman, basically says, "Hey, I'm just here for a couple of aspirin. I already have a Purple Heart." That it's not the medals, but it was just the basics that were needed for survival. And your illustration that war is hell, I think, is clearly what he's trying to show. But it's not just between the Americans and those that they're fighting against, but it's also the discrepancies between generals and infantrymen. Does that make sense?
It does. And, one of the cartoons that he's probably best known for is the Willie and Joe characters, where he created a whole bunch of different cartoons. And they're just these little one slide cartoons that show these characters in various situations. And he will put along the bottom a brief quote or a brief description of something that's going on, something that he's hoping to get across, an idea he's hoping to get across. Just, I guess, in case anybody missed the message of the cartoon itself. One man who did not miss a message of one of his cartoons, however, was General George Patton. Patton once referred to Mauldin as an unpatriotic anarchist and really didn't like him and wanted to, he wanted to punish wanted to punish Mauldin for a cartoon he had drawn in which he was critical of Patton, because Patton had a policy that basically all soldiers, I guess, were supposed to be clean shaven at all times, which of course you're on the battlefield, you're in foxholes, you're crawling through mud. And here you've got this general who's worried about whether people are clean shaven or not. And Mauldin uses his voice as a cartoonist, a military cartoonist, to basically criticize General Patton's approach, his policy there. And it's interesting who comes to his defense. Was none other than Dwight Eisenhower, who came to his defense and basically told Patton, leave the guy alone.
Yeah, but Patton wasn't extremely happy with Eisenhower's response. He didn't really, he didn't care about that. And Eisenhower is basically saying, listen, if we start censoring what's going on, then we're just turning into the group we're fighting against. And it's going to undermine Army morale. And, and this just can't happen. And it was interesting because Mauldin and Patton, so they have this meeting. And there's this columnist or reporter with Time magazine who heard that Patton and Mauldin had met after all of this. And, they said, hey, what happened? And so Mauldin gave a quote and basically said, well, I kind of came out with my hide still on. He didn't chew me too much, but we parted friends, but I don't think we changed each other's minds.
Yeah.
Well, the reporter from Time magazine published that. And it went through all the newspapers and everybody heard it. And Patton was furious and said, so help me, if I ever see you again, I'll throw your butt in jail. And he probably would have done a lot more to him. And, and Mauldin basically goes back and says, listen, I admire Patton. Yeah. He thought he was crazy. He thought he was insane. He thought he was living in the dark ages. He didn't like the attitude, but he respected the military genius behind him. So I think you had two guys that were trying to do the same thing to highlight what was going on in the war, but they went about it different ways. And Patton was very stubborn, bullheaded. And it seems like this Mauldin was kind of the same way, because he just wanted people to understand. And that really, I think, wouldn't you agree that little disagreement between Patton and Mauldin is what really sets his career forward? Because after that, Willie and Joe, they start taking off. He becomes very well known, doing a lot of other political cartoons even after the war.
Yeah, and it's important that Mauldin has the support of the War Office and also has the support of, maybe not necessarily the support of Eisenhower, but at least Eisenhower understood that Mauldin's cartoons were important for the soldiers. It was an expression of the soldiers' frustrations, of the soldiers' opinions about things. You know, when you've got Patton and others coming out with these rules that the average soldier looked at and went, "What are you doing?" Mauldin's cartoons were a way for that voice to be heard. And Eisenhower certainly understood that. Whatever he personally thought of it, he understood the benefit of giving the soldiers that voice and the danger, or I don't know, maybe not the word danger, but the bad side of trying to silence that voice wouldn't have helped the soldiers in any way. And you know, you mentioned a quote a few minutes ago when you were talking about Mauldin's quote about George Patton, where he basically said, "I thought he was crazy." But he does say in there as well, however, that soldiers were nothing but peasants to him. You know, that he looked down on the average soldier, at least according to Mauldin. And I think this is where Eisenhower was coming from, that it gave the soldiers an ability to sort of speak back to that. You know, as we would say today, speak truth to power type of thing.
Yeah. And I mean, this is not the episode on Patton, but Patton had one idea of what truth was, and that's whatever he thought it was. You know, I mean, but you have to understand, it's just like MacArthur, it's like Grant, it's like any of these great military leaders. You know, they really kind of thought that they had the very best interest of the soldiers, but also of the war efforts and things of that nature. But, you know, I do think that Willie and Joe were rallying cries. I really appreciate what you said about that. The soldiers needed to hear this. They needed to know that somebody had their respect and someone had their back. And, you know, and that person was found in Bill Mauldin, who, whether it was just drawing a picture that made them come alive through two Oklahoma boys, you know, who were just common, ordinary men who found themselves fighting in the deep trenches in a war, a world war at that. It gave them hope, but it also gave them a name, and it gave a message that the whole world could hear.
Yeah, and one of the things that happens to Mauldin that gives him even more credibility with the average soldier, not just simply that he was willing to publish things that maybe they were afraid to say, but in 1943 in September, he's actually wounded by a German mortar in the arm. And of course, now his voice is amplified even more. Because of his injury, and you know, his experience, you know, sharing that experience with his fellow soldiers. You mentioned Willie and Joe. One of the things that he wanted to do on his final day of combat was to kill off those characters, and the paper that he was publishing then wouldn't let him do it. Because he, you know, I guess it was his final day of combat. It was his final outing, and he wanted to move on to other things. But they refused to let him kill off those two characters, which I think is probably a good thing.
Yeah, because even if you look into the political cartoons of today's society, I think that soldiers can still go into those Willie and Joe, and they can still see those books, and they still have the opportunity to use those to have their voices heard. And you know, I think that's an important thing. I didn't know that. I'm thankful that he didn't do that, because I think that it would have presented the wrong story, right? And
yeah, and you know, in 1945, Willie from Willie and Joe was on the cover of Time magazine. I mean, these were influential characters that were very important to soldiers in the field, but also, I guess, to some degree, to the American people. He's going to win the Pulitzer Prize in 1945 at the age of 23. I mean, think about this. What had you done by the age of 23, Chris? I hadn't done much of anything productive anyway.
I'm 47 and I still haven't done anything.
Yeah, I mean, I'm the same boat.
Yeah.
But at 23, he wins the Pulitzer Prize. And when he comes back from the war, he's actually going to turn to political cartoons. He's going to go from military cartoons to political cartoons. And he really, Chris, we could say, you know, at the time he was sort of on the liberal side. And that sort of putting put him on the outs with some people. For example, in 1956, he ran for the U.S. Congress in New York's 28th district, and it was a very rural district. And he talks about this, and he basically says, you know, I went out and talked to these people and tried to campaign, but you know, I don't know them. I don't represent them. I mean, this is not a very good fit. He doesn't win, obviously, but he understood that his views maybe weren't necessarily in line with the views of the people he was seeking to represent.
And I think the hard thing for him, as it was for many of the soldiers, was leaving the theater of war and coming back to society. You know, we hear the stories all of the time of the struggles that soldiers have in reintroducing themselves to society, into, you know, let's just say it here in America. Regardless of the war, individuals have a hard time with adjustment. And we see that with Mauldin. I mean, the war is over. He can't use Willie and Joe anymore. He can't talk about the war. He can't draw. He's been doing this. This has been his life. And so you're right. He starts drawing cartoons that attacks racism. He goes after the Ku Klux Klan. He's strong about McCarthyism. He's doing all of these things, but it doesn't catch on like the images from war caught on. And Mauldin seems to kind of go into a state of depression. And he, you know, as you mentioned, he runs for office. And I think the reason he runs for office is because he's given up cartooning. Yeah. He's lost his way. He's trying to find a new path. He's trying to find new opportunities. And, you know, I as you mentioned, he says he didn't think he was that liberal. I think he was. He just didn't know it, and he just didn't want to say it. But I think that, and you can go look at his cartoons, and you know, that's the thing about cartoons, is they say a lot without saying anything. It's the images that draw. And if you go look at some of them, it's very clear his stance on certain issues. And so many newspapers didn't want to take on somebody who had that strong of a political view, because you could lose circulation, you could lose customers, you lose newspaper sales, and they had to be careful. But he does get some more jobs, right? He kind of gets back into cartooning after that kind of hiatus for a little bit. And that probably takes us to his most famous cartoon, I guess, especially most famous after the war.
Yeah, you know, he does win a second Nobel Prize for a cartoon in which he shows Soviet author Boris Pasternak in a gulag. And basically the idea is he's being punished for his crime of literature. You know, Mauldin wins the Pulitzer Prize again for the second time in his life for that particular cartoon. He works as a writer for a period of time, writing articles that would appear in places like Life magazine, of all places. But you talk about one of his most infamous cartoons, which was published in 1963, following the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. And if you look at the cartoon, it's the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. And President Lincoln, you know, the statue of Lincoln there in the Lincoln Memorial, and President Lincoln is leaning over and he's got his hands on his face as part of this cartoon. And you talking about saying a lot without saying anything, that cartoon did it.
Yeah, and it's extremely powerful. And that's why I really think this podcast doesn't do justice to his cartoons unless one's to go and actually take a moment and to review them and to see that. And Ray, you know, he kind of, after all of these things happen, I mean, he does what you say. He goes back and he's writing and he's doing some cartoonist, and, you know, he's got some things here or there, but basically what starts to happen is towards the end of his career, and actually towards the end of his life, he kind of loses his area, maybe his not focus, but he just couldn't connect. I guess that's the best way to say it. I don't know. He kind of starts to fade away from society as a cartoonist.
Yeah, and he does some work, but during the last years of his life, he really just racks up a whole bunch of awards, including the Walter Cronkite Awards for Excellent in Journalism. He really, I think it is fair to say that his time in World War II and following the Lincoln the Clinton, oh my goodness, the Kennedy assassination, those were sort of the high spots. He comes down with Alzheimer's disease. And he dies on January 22, 2003, with complications from Alzheimer's disease and something. I guess he had scalded himself in the bathtub or something. So he dies in 2003. So he lived a long life. What was he, 81 years old? He lived a long life, won many accolades and many awards for his cartoons, for his journalism, for his important work on the field in World War II, for his important articles and cartoons here in the United States as a political cartoonist. So absolutely a life well lived was Bill Mauldin.
And it's a life well lived, and it's a life that many people like me, who would simply say this is history you didn't know, but should. And the final thing that I would share about the reflections of Bill Mauldin is the end of his life. I read an interesting recount, that he was trying to sell books and he was unsuccessful. Nobody was buying his stuff. As you mentioned, he is diagnosed with Alzheimer's and his memory is starting to fail. His health is going bad. And the story that I recalled is that he ends up being hospitalized. And people start finding out that he's hospitalized. And suddenly, all of these individuals start writing him letters. All of these ex-infantrymen who served in World War II started showing up in his hospital room. And there's this reporting that shows that if you were to have gone into his hospital room, you would have seen pictures and letters posted all over the walls, even on the ceiling. And I think what that shows is that he was a beloved figure. He was connected. He was trying to share a deep, dark, intimate moment of what life is like on the front lines that many of us will never experience and many of us will never be able to understand. And that he was able to connect how war is held by painting a picture of it that would remain imprinted on our minds. But he did it because he told the truth. There was no fake news here. It was just straight up real life. This is what it looks like. It's messy, it's ugly, and it's not just war against the other enemy, but sometimes it's war against each other. But at the end of the day, you fight for your brother and you support your brother and you come in community with your brother and you become victorious. And I think that happened. So, he told the truth, and history will always remember him for being that person that shared with us what it really looked like to be a fighter. So I'm so thankful that I can now say that this is history I don't know, but it's history I do know.
Absolutely. Enjoyed this episode, Chris. Hope our listeners did. If our listeners would like to contact us, recommend a show suggestion, a topic, they can always do so. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter. They can always email us at historyyousshouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know @gmail.com. Find our podcast on Spotify, Sounder FM, and other podcast locations. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
We'll talk at you later.